So do you keep trying something like this, but continue to feel stiffness and tightness in your hip flexors? It's time to start strengthening your hip flexors. Let me show you 4 exercises you can try. Hey Prehab, welcome back. I'm Dr. Dorian St. Danik. Let me ask you a question. When was the last time you did a hip flexor strength exercise at the gym? Have you ever strained your hip flexor and tried loading instead of stretching? For most of you, the answer is probably no and never. So let me give you a different perspective today about why adding in hip flexor strength training can be a game changer for you. A hip flexor is a muscle that functions in flexing the hip. In other words, bringing the knee closer to the spine. Hip flexors muscle include the iliacus, the psoas, the pectineus, the rectus femoris, and the sartorius. For our purposes, we're gonna focus on iliacus and psoas, also known as the iliopsoas. So the iliacus muscle is a triangle-shaped muscle fitting flat on the inside of the pelvis, and then sneaks around to the lesser trochanter of the femur, which is the outside of the upper thigh bone. Psoas muscle is shaped like a rope, and it originates on the vertebra of the lower thoracic, as well as the lumbar spine. It also sneaks through and attaches with the iliacus muscle, finally attaching to that outside of the thigh bone. So a few things we need to consider when training the iliopsoas. Based on its attachment at the spine, the pelvis, and the hip, the iliopsoas has 2 main functions. Yes, it is a powerful hip flexor, but it also assists with maintaining upright posture. It works to keep our spine stable during hip postures and hip motions. This includes sitting, walking. So we develop these tight or stiff hip flexors after sitting, not necessarily because they're sitting in a shortened position, but because they're being asked to stabilize in a shortened position. So if we never strengthen in these positions, you may continue to struggle with that tightness as you haven't built up your strength or your endurance when that muscle is short. So let's dive into exercises that will help not only with tolerance to sitting position, but also higher intensity activities such as lunging, running, and cycling. All right, so for the first exercise, this one is the psoas march in a tabletop position. This exercise is gonna focus on activation of our hip flexors without necessarily activating our low back. So for this exercise, we do need a mini loop band, like a 360 loop band. We're gonna attach this band to our feet, kind of right around the arches, and we're gonna take that tabletop position. So that's lying down on your back with the knees to the chest, and we have this 90-degree angle at the hip and at the knees. We're gonna try to keep our back flat into the ground as we start and throughout the exercise. So I'm gonna move my left leg to kick out to a straight leg reach while holding my right leg in that 90-degree angle at the hip and the knee. I'm gonna return back, and there's really no tension here. I'm in kind of a midline position for my hip flexors. The tension in the work comes from when my left leg kicks out. I'm trying to avoid dropping that right leg, so I'm holding steady and stable with my right thigh. You're gonna wanna feel this on the leg that's not moving, so that would be the front side of my right hip. What we don't wanna feel is our low back starting to get tense or starting to get fatigued. So if you start feeling that tension in the back, or actually you start feeling like your back is starting to come off the ground, try to cue yourself once again to stay flat. If that's still tough, you can take, let's say, a weight bench or a heavy dumbbell up above to stabilize your spine, hanging on overhead, and then get back to these marches. And it should be a little bit easier to hold your pelvis and your spine in one position. Another way to regress is if you just wanted to take that band at the knees. Now you have less of a tension as you start to reach out. So it's not as much demand for that leg that's kicking out. We would say one progression to this is actually if you let the legs out straight, now you're gonna reach up into that neutral position. So kind of 3 variations for us there, but we're still just working on activation, turning this muscle on. So as you program for this, try 3 sets, 20 to 25 reps, and you can do this one daily. So for our second exercise, this is the incline plank with a leg lift. This is gonna help build upon the activation piece we had with the last exercise. Now we're working through motor control. So we're gonna be going through hip flexion, hip extension, Once again, trying to target the hip flexors. I'm gonna reference my right leg again. So you're gonna need a bench, a box, a chair, just something you can elevate yourself on so you have a little bit of space underneath your body. I've got a forearm plank position. I'm gonna bring my hips down. I got my chin tucked, my core is engaged. I'm trying to hold my spine steady. I'm gonna go ahead and lift my left leg up, which means right now I'm trying not to drop down. So my hip flexor on my right side is actually trying to hold me up in this position a bit. I'm gonna go ahead and dip into what is spine extension and hip extension, and then rise up into a little bit of flexion. So hip extension as the legs come down, and then hip flexion as the glutes go to the ceiling. What we want to try to avoid is just dipping the low back. Make sure the whole leg and pelvis are moving together, and then back up. So I'm actually feeling pretty good work through this hip here. This one's really helpful for upright postures like standing and walking. You're gonna wanna try these for about 2 to 3 rounds, 30 to 45 seconds. You can do this one 4 to 5 days a week. And again, this one's gonna really complement what we learned in the last one, learning where that muscle is and then trying to control it through our hip extension range of motion. All right, so for our third exercise, this is the eccentric Thomas. For this exercise, we're really gonna start loading the hip flexors with a little bit of a higher intensity. I actually gave this to a client last week who was having some pain with sprinting, some higher intensity sprints, and it actually helped clear up some of the pain during the sprint. So it really does start to match kind of our functional and weight bearing demands on the hip flexors. You're gonna need a table or a high box or even a bed works really well for this. And when you set yourself up, make sure you're sitting all the way at the edge of the table, not necessarily glutes on, but glutes at the edge of the table. You're also going to need a weight. A kettlebell works really well because we have the handle. Otherwise, if you have a dumbbell, you could use like a heavy TheraBand and wrap it to the bottom of the foot. There are also models out there called the monkey foot or the tib raise bar that can actually attach directly to the foot, and you can add in some weight plates to those. I'm gonna use this kettlebell. It's 20 pounds. You could probably start with about 10 pounds for this exercise. We're gonna hook the kettlebell just past the toes towards the arch of the foot. And then getting to the edge of the table, we're gonna find our tabletop position. We're gonna reference the left hip for this one. Right knee to chest, about as far as you can go. And that's gonna help stabilize the low back. Let's try to get 90 degrees at the floating working hip, and then very slowly, like a 5 to 6 second tempo, start to let this left thigh drop down towards the ground, bracing, holding position at the spine, and seeing, can we get that thigh to go not just to neutral, but even past what is gonna be parallel to the table here. So I'm still working pretty hard from this hip flexor. From here, I'm gonna bend my knee a little bit, scoop my leg up, extend my knee, and then repeat that process, 5 to 6 second drop, eccentric strengthening of my left hip flexor. So the compensations we wanna look out for, once again, it's gonna be that hyperextension, the lifting off the low back. Make sure you're using the right thigh or the opposite thigh to help stabilize your low back. Another compensation, if this leg starts to deviate outward from your body or the knee starts to straighten at you as you kick out, you've lost some of that tension at the hip flexor. So stay aligned, stay at 90 at the knee, and hold steady until you finish past parallel. Very tough exercise. So we're gonna keep the sets and reps a little lower here. 2 to 4 sets, 6 to 8 reps, 2 to 3 times a week. Again, this is gonna be a great transfer over to our more functional weight-bearing positions as we've started to load that hip flexor a little bit more. All right, last exercise, exercise number 4. This is our march with a power band. So we're really getting to our progressive strength training here, meaning we should be able to gradually progress our resistance or our speed and tempo with this particular exercise. So as we're trying to get back to sport, as we're trying to get back to our activities that we want to do. It's a great exercise to really keep working at week to week and keep trying to progress either resistance or tempo. For this exercise, we will need a short step. I have a block here. It's going to help me create a little bit of a riser for my leg to be able to swing. We do also need a power band. So that's going to be like our long looped band, and we're going to attach that at about ankle height. And it is helpful if you can have an ankle strap that is going to attach to the power band. Otherwise, we should be able to kind of wrap it around the foot and ankle to create a steady anchor. As we set up, we want to think about some of the same compensations and mechanics from the last few exercises. Keep your ribs down as you march up so that you don't end up hyperextending through the low back and overloading some of the structures in the low back while underloading the hip. It also does help to have something to balance with. We don't need balance to take away from the power of this exercise. So in reference to my left hip, that's going to be my hip flexion march. I've got my right foot elevated. I'm going to go slow for these first few. I'm hinged forward a little bit, nose over toes. As I drive my left leg through, my spine gets taller, my right leg locks out straight, and I've got that 90-degree angle at my hip and my knee. As I come out of it, I'm gonna hinge down, unlock my right hip and right knee, and then I'm back to my starting position, like a short stride split stance. So in real time, we're gonna use the biomechanics of the hip flexor, right? A powerful hip flexor. We're gonna try to move with some speed and try to get to this position as quickly as we can, slow on the way down. So I set up and I think, hey, I'm gonna swing left leg through to this 90-90 position. That's where I'm gonna pause, make sure I'm stable, and come off. So as we get better with this, we can increase the speed and start moving with quickness and increase tempo, or we could increase the actual resistance of the band. When you get up there, don't hyperextend, lock out through the right hip, stay down with the ribs. That's gonna keep you from getting into your low back. So again, this is a great one to kind of graduate to. Keep at it 2-3 days a week, anywhere from 6 to 12 reps, and make sure you're actually using a band that challenges fatigue in the hip. And you'll even start to see your performance improve with activities such as running, cycling, and even your weight room gym exercises. All right, so let's summarize what we learned today. Hip flexors are both postural stabilizers and powerful movers of the hip. They will respond to longer duration contractions as well as high force quick motions. Improving the capacity of the hip flexors can help you with sitting tolerance as well as performance with lunging, marching, and running sports. Start with the exercise such as the first one you saw today and progressively work towards exercise at higher forces to further challenge your hip flexor muscles, get you feeling strong, and start to decrease some of that tightness and stiffness in your hips. If you're looking for exercises like this and more, go ahead and check out our hip rehab and prehab programs in the app.